So we're going to go ahead and get started since it's 6:30. So welcome to our third seminar in our series on evaluating the news. Hopefully after this week, things will get a little bit more positive. I like to end things on a good note, so we have a couple more weeks yet. But before we begin, how do you get your news? Think about that. Do you seek it out, or is it shared with you? And here's an important one. What issues do you care about that the news media doesn't talk about? And that'll be an important point for today. So imagine being a young adult 70 years ago. Now, for some of you, this might not be too much of a stretch, but still, I think I'm safe to say no one here is over 90. But, if you wanted to learn a fact, where would you go? So back in the 1950s, where would you go if you wanted to learn a fact about something? Library? Yes. Encyclopedia, right? Okay. If you wanted to find out about a current event, how could you get the information? Radio. On the radio. And the newspaper, right? So those are your options. So today's topics for discussion are: what is a gatekeeper for information? What is censorship? What is fake news? I know people have been waiting for that one. What are fact checkers? And how are technology and news media companies related to all of the above? And that's a question that we'll come back to over the next couple weeks as well. So let's start with the information not-so-superhighway. Most information we get comes to us at least secondhand. So almost all the information we have doesn't come to us straight from the source. It is passed through another person's hands at some point. The label on your food, the information on your car, anything that you read or see on the internet, the recipe that you get, it's all secondhand. And so who and or what does the information go through before it gets to us? Think about that. All the information that we're receiving, it has to pass through another person first. So who's in charge of that? And for this, the term that we librarians use are informational gatekeepers. So it's a person that controls the flow of information. Are they good? Are they bad? Or is it a depends kind of a thing? And there are examples of all three possibilities. So how does something become a gatekeeper? Does it arise out of a societal necessity? Is it something that's imposed by governmental regulation? What are the different ways that someone becomes a gatekeeper of information? So let's take a look at some historical examples. And so one of the oldest are the Chinese literati. So for many, many dynasties in China, Confucianism was the reigning philosophy. And they built an entire bureaucracy about understanding Confucian values and ideas. And the bureaucracy were these, you could compare them to university professors today. So imagine if all government officials were university professors who were very self-assured that they knew more than you and that they had to pass very rigorous tests showing that they had memorized thousands of pages. These were some of the first informational gatekeepers. Some that might be a little bit more familiar to you are Catholic monks who had repositories of books and manuscripts in many different countries over many years. Dictatorships are historical examples of gatekeepers where they hoard things for themselves. And librarians are historical examples of gatekeepers in which we collect information and make it available to people. So think about some modern examples. Librarians, we're still here. Internet connections. So you connect to the internet. How is that connection controlled? You pay a company to do so, right? It's their equipment, it's their infrastructure. They are a gatekeeper to your access to the internet and news media and government. So what is it that gatekeepers do? Well, they store information. What are modern repositories of information? Throw out some ideas. Okay, library, modern digital encyclopedias like Wikipedia, which is a common source encyclopedia, other places online. What about actual physical places where information is stored besides a library? Museums, okay, excellent. The government. The government, they have repositories and archives and things like that. Okay.
Your personal collections.
Your personal collections, individuals, right, can have that. And so how do you access these different things? Sometimes you have to physically go there, or you have to connect to the internet. Sometimes you have to have a membership, or you have to pay an entrance fee. All of these things present a barrier to connecting to that information in some way. Sometimes it's an economic barrier. Sometimes it's a logistical barrier. There are different ways that that is done. Gatekeepers also organize information. Some gatekeepers, I suppose, would just put everything in a giant pile, but most places that you visit have things organized in some way. It's structured, either categorically or chronologically or to follow a narrative. But gatekeepers organize information. And so how is that done with technology today?
It's computerized.
It's computerized. How many of you have used a search function or a search engine? How many of you know how a search engine works? Okay. Gatekeepers are the ones who put together the backside of the search engine so that when you type in words, it connects to all the pieces of information that may relate to those words you search for. They're the ones who put that together. And so they are gatekeepers because if they choose not to link a piece of information to a word, all of a sudden, even if you search for it, it's not connected. And so you've been denied access to that piece of information. Think about that.
Don't they control which order it comes into?
Control which?
I'm lazy.
Oh.
I put a Google search in there, I read the first 2 or 3. I don't read the ones that are 15 down.
And you should never ever do that. Because yes, search engine companies control the order in which things are put in, but it's controlled by money.
Oh, absolutely.
Companies can, depending on the search engine, bid to have their results bumped up the list. And so the first results that pop up are not necessarily the one that you're looking for. That happens a lot with government websites. Say if you wanted to go to, if you search Department of the Interior, you're going to get 3, 4, 5 advertisements or other websites before you actually see the Department of the Interior website. So it all depends on who's paying more money. So they preserve information. And so in today's world, how is information being lost?
Thrown away.
Okay, things get thrown away. Right? We're receiving so much information all the time that we have to constantly evaluate, is this worth it for me to continue to have, remember, think about? We do that all day long, every day. Is the world a peaceful place yet?
No.
No. And so there are tremendous amounts of information and knowledge that are lost due to warfare. And that's a sad thing. How is information being protected?
Vaults.
Vaults. Well, yeah, you can keep it in a vault. And even information for the internet is kept in some actual physical vaults in some very out-of-the-way places. But libraries, museums, those are places that strive, and archives are places that strive to protect information so that it is still available later on.
Some churches as well.
Oh, yes, very much so. Churches especially are a wonderful resource for doing genealogy and family history work with the things that they archive. The gatekeepers evaluate information. So even on a website, and certainly in a physical space, you are limited in what you can store, either by the amount of data that can flow or by the actual space you have on shelves and so forth. And so there comes a point in time where a gatekeeper has to evaluate and say, what can I keep and what do I have to let go? What should I preserve and what should I not?
Does that depend on what people have asked for? You know, like
That
if
can.
20 people have asked for a certain thing, they'll keep it longer than if nobody asked for it.
So if we use an analogy and think about going to, Walmart, say, you go into the store, the types of items that are on the shelves and in the aisles are a reflection of a number of things. Supply and demand, as well as what the store team and maybe corporate headquarters and statistical data show people are likely to want or buy. Right? So that can hold up in gatekeeping organizations, especially for-profit ones like internet companies. For libraries, it's always a bit rough, but having a healthy collection is important. If you have a book that's been sitting there a long time, maybe there's one person out there who'd like it, and so we can put it on a book sale, and that person will get it. But if there are other items that people are requesting that we don't have and we want to make available, then those are things that we do have to consider. Yeah. And, okay, we just talked through both these. Good questions so far tonight. Gatekeepers restrict information. Why would a gatekeeper restrict access to information?
Well, in order to obtain it, you sometimes have to sign an agreement that says you will restrict it for so many years after the person's death. So you get it into the collection with a restriction so it can be there later.
Okay, so there can be legal concerns and qualifications. The wishes of the person who had the information, that can play into it. Why else does information get restricted?
The narrative of the gatekeeper.
Okay, it doesn't fit the narrative or the perspective of the gatekeeper. So that happens all the time, right? Sometimes information is deemed or evaluated as dangerous or need to know. So we have things that get classified or that get confidential or have a gag order or whatever it might be. That information is deemed to, if it were known more widely, to cause harm in some way. But again, who's making those decisions and how are they accountable? That's what we're gonna be talking about a bit today. So what are some good and bad examples of restricting information? We've mentioned a few things.
Book burning in Nazi Germany.
Okay, so restricting information can be destruction, and that's actually my next point on here. That's a bad example, right, of restricting information. Probably one of the most ancient examples of this is once again from China. The first Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huang, in order to linguistically unify his kingdom, destroyed all of the writings that were not in the writing system that he wanted everyone to use. And so that was a lot of manuscripts and scrolls and bamboo slats that were all destroyed because they didn't fit in what he wanted politically for his kingdom. Politically very savvy move, because if everybody's writing the same way and speaking the same way, then it's much easier for communication and control. But as a librarian, it's rough. And as you mentioned, they destroy information. And so here's an important question. Is all information worth keeping?
No.
No, right? There's some information that is only relevant or important in a very limited time frame, or is only important in a particular place. And so in that time frame or that place, they can be important for people that are dealing with those, but outside of that time and place, they're not very relevant to anyone else, and so that's not something that other people need to hold on to. So, on the bad side, or maybe not, of gatekeeping, there's lots of opinions on this. Censorship is the restricting of access to information, including destroying information. It can start with gatekeepers, or it can start with groups that share a belief or opinion, or even it can start with an individual. Right? It was simpler to do 800 years ago. And why is that? Well, it's because information depositories were limited by space, geography, and resources. If you were able to hoard a bunch of information in one place, all you had to do was lock it up. And people had to come to you and then get your permission or forcibly take it from you in order to access it. It's not so easy today. And censorship today is usually more targeted. It's not a broad hoarding of information as in we have all the knowledge and you don't have any. But it's broad censorship when it's tried now requires the use of force, whether that's physical, economic, or otherwise. And we see that in dictatorships today where they will exert broad control over all the different organizations that can disseminate information, whether that's educational institutions or news media, and we'll take a look at some of that in a bit. And so how has technology changed censorship now?
Things are more available.
Things are more available. It's harder to censor, right? It's not as simple as it was 800 years ago, because once something's on the internet, it is on there forever. The only way it would ever disappear is if we had some sort of solar flare that completely fried everything. Once it's there, even if you think you deleted it. Someone, if they have the inclination and ability, can find it. And so if you try to block information, somebody could have screenshotted it, somebody could have saved it, somebody could have done something that then allows them to reshare it, and it keeps going on. And this can be a good thing if people are trying to repress information that people should know, and it can be a bad thing if people are spreading false information continuously. Yeah. And so let's look at some current examples of how technology has changed the way censorship is done. And so someone mentioned Wikipedia, and so I think we at least go to Wikipedia once. And so how many of you have heard of the Fanghua Changcheng, the Great Firewall of China? Anyone heard of that? See some heads nodding, see some heads shaking. So the Chinese government has put together extraordinary economic and human resources in order to restrict and control internet flow into and out of their country, as well as domestically. There are words that are banned, there are images that are banned, there are websites that are banned, there are companies that are banned. They control what they think the people should be able to access. It's the strongest amount of internet censorship in the world today. Maybe not the most complete. Smaller countries might be able to do it more easily if you had a small dictatorship, but it's definitely the strongest in terms of just the sheer amount of money and people that the Chinese government employs to do this. And since we're talking about this, once I post this on YouTube, it might be censored in China. So, reporters get censored. They can.
Access to pornographic or adult type images on the computer.
Okay, we'll get to that point in a bit, Carl, who's on our library board, yep. So,
Go, Carl.
Reporters Without Borders puts out a report every year of world press freedom. And so this is their report from 2021. And the higher your rank, the more open and transparent and easy it is for reporters to publish things, and That's the lighter the color, and the darker the color, the harder it is and the more likely you are to be censored. So you notice the United States is not in the really light color there.
No.
Where do you think we are on the list? We'll scroll down here. Where do you think we are?
10.
10th?
Yeah, let's just guess.
Okay, let's take a look.
No, didn't even get there. Wow.
Wow.
Look at that. That's scary.
There we are, number 44. So think about that. The level of censorship that we have in the United States. But going back to Carl's point.
Censorship by who?
Censorship by whom? There's a very good question. And so in this case, that was specifically for reporters trying to share a story. And next week, we're going to talk more about journalism and journalism ethics and what that means. But just very briefly is someone uncovers a piece of information, they want to share it, and either the government says you can't share that, or they get arrested, or the government seizes the information, or the company they work for says you can't publish that, or it gets published, but then other companies who don't like that information exert economic influence on website traffic, and again, like with search engines, they restrict the information so people can't find it. And we're going to talk about that more in just a bit.
What company has the least censorship?
Which country has the least censorship? I think it was Norway or Sweden.
Norway, yeah.
So, yep.
Yeah.
Going back to Carl's point, that libraries act as censors in that we restrict access to information. So the example that Carl gave is pornography. There's plenty of medical and psychological and economic things related to pornography as a business and what it does to people. But a lot of communities would agree that that's something that children should not see. And so it's often the case that libraries have a filter on their computers that prevents children from being exposed to pornography. Not all libraries do, but it is something that is common and culturally and socially speaking.
Leroy, is
Yes.
there books here in this library, if I was under 18, I couldn't check out?
No.
Okay, that, yeah.
So there are definitely books
when I
that
was a
have
child.
There are definitely books that have very graphic content, but we don't restrict. As librarians, we feel that is not our job. If a parent has expectations for their child, then they need to talk to their child about that and discuss it with them. That's not our job. So, Wikileaks, very controversial organization. So, do you think what he does is good or what he does is bad? Those are very evaluative terms and very opinionated, right? But what is it that he does? Is he has created, through technology, a means for people to share government secrets that can then be published broadly on the internet. Okay? In some cases, it has brought to light misconduct by governments, yes? And in other cases, it has exposed national secrets that have caused diplomatic tension, that have caused people's lives to be in danger. And so people love him, people hate him, right? But you cannot deny that there are governments that are aggressively trying to censor this man and what he does. Absolutely. Because they think what he's doing is dangerous to what they want. Okay, there's censorship against social media. Woohoo, 2020 had more censorship. But so when we say against social media, this is something that is done either by an internet providing company or more likely by a government, in which they shut down access to social media because, again, technology has made it harder to censor. because people can share things, and social media is a tool that makes that very easy to share information. And so most of it happened in Africa. African governments censored a lot of social media. If you've seen any international headlines, you may have seen that Nigeria, for quite a while, censored Twitter. Twitter was not allowed in the country.
Isn't that what Twitter did to Trump?
Hmm?
Isn't that what Twitter did to Trump?
Yes, is they censored him by blocking him from their platform. And so it happens
Not that
all
I'm
the time.
opposed, but
Right. Well, we're getting to that. So right now we're talking about against social media. So where institutions and governments have restricted social media to prevent people from communicating with each other. But that is an example of my next, well, not quite next, but opinions from the public get censored. Fine. Okay. All right. So as far as the internet itself, so access to the internet and censorship of that connection, the top 3 countries for internet censorship as a whole are there, and the bottom are there. China, Iran, Syria, Cuba, Vietnam. Is anybody surprised by the ones on the bottom?
No.
No, right? Is anyone surprised by the ones on the front, on the top? A little bit?
Yeah.
Maybe?
Estonia surprises me.
Estonia surprises you?
Yeah,
well, could be the United States isn't there.
And so,
but Estonia surprises me. Iceland, I expected.
why would I link to this under the heading Opinions from the Public?
US is not there.
The internet allows anyone, if they have the knowledge, to post information of any kind, right? You can share what you think on the internet. You can find a forum for it. You can create a forum for it. You can share it, right? That technology has made it much easier to share information. You don't have to write it out anymore and then make copies and then post them around town, although we do still do that. And so there are countries that don't like that kind of widespread opinion sharing because they want certain ideas to not be available for people to think about, right? Okay, here we go. Bye, social media. Okay. Okay, and we're going to talk more about this later, but we're going to just read briefly from this. It says, for many years, people hoped the internet would become the ultimate communications platform, freeing people from barriers imposed by cost and geography, and truly enabling anyone, anywhere to engage with others, right? In this utopian vision, online speech could be truly free, especially if people could maintain anonymity. And the internet could become a positive force for alternative views that might not get attention from conventional media. Mark Zuckerberg even famously proclaimed social media applications to be the fifth estate, enabling common people to express views and enabling truth to be held to power far more effectively than they had been possible with the fourth estate, the conventional media. Fast forwarding to 2021, it's becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile these aspirational free speech objectives with the actions of social media platforms. Almost daily, platforms are closing accounts and denying access to specific individuals. Twitter's permanent ban of Donald Trump, Instagram's deplatforming of Robert Kennedy, or removing content on the basis that the views expressed are harmful, incite division within society, or are simply against community standards, however those might be defined. This is in addition to removing content in some countries at the behest of governments, even though it can be viewed freely in others. So social media sometimes works with the government, sometimes against the government, sometimes for their own purposes, right? And so technology has made some methods of censorship easier and some methods a lot harder. And so, but when you can't censor, how do you restrict information? That's the question. What can a gatekeeper do to restrict access to information when censorship is not possible? So in other words, you can't actually restrict it, but how can you restrict it without restricting it? How do you do that? Well, remember the methods of political propaganda that we talked about? Encourage people to distrust other sources, claim to be the authoritative, trustworthy source, and claim special knowledge, privilege, or access to sources. If you can't block access, convince people not to engage. And so you don't have to restrict the information if you can get people to self-censor. And how do they do that? Fallacies that we talked about last week. Now this links back to what we looked at last week, and I know people had shared those out. So what do people today call this strategy of using fallacies to dissuade, denigrate, and distract? Fake news, right? It's not a new idea to discredit an idea, right? And we looked at some of those fallacies which have been around for a long, long time that people use to try to make you not consider a piece of information by trying to make the person sharing it look bad, or by bringing up something irrelevant, or whatever it might be. And the assumption here is that the source of information determines its validity and truthfulness. So in other words, because of who said it or who published it, that's what makes information true or false. And that is a fallacy, right? If Donald Trump says the world is round, and because you hate Donald Trump, you refuse to believe the world is round, that's not good logical thinking, right? If Joe Biden says that there's no snow in Antarctica, but you really like Joe Biden, and so you believe there's no snow in Antarctica, that's not logical thinking. You don't just trust information because of who or where it comes from. In other words, trust the gatekeeper is what they want you to do. Accept the information you're given. Right? So it's seen from the Wizard of Oz movie with Judy Garland, of course. The great and powerful Oz with all his pomp and circumstance and smoke and mirrors. Pay no attention to the man that's behind the curtain. Ask no questions, otherwise, fallacies attack. You're not a true American because you're asking this question. Or you're a terrible person because you don't think this, right? How about some older examples of fake news? Well, how old are we talking about, maybe, okay? So, who knows the story about Hans Christian Andersen, The Emperor's New Clothes, right? So this is a wonderful example of how an entire narrative was propped up by this false idea. And that all the adults, because they didn't want to be embarrassed because of societal pressure, remember this is a bandwagon fallacy, they all say, oh, these new clothes are wonderful, when the emperor is naked. And it takes a little kid to say, hey, he's got no clothes on, right? The 1890s newspaper wars. So we already mentioned Joseph Pulitzer, and it was also mentioned William Randolph Hearst. So as they started to create their newspaper empires in the 1890s, and they worked to try to get readership across the country and outdo each other with the newspapers that they owned, they tried to one-up each other with this idea of yellow journalism. And so I will state this up front. This is a racist term. It was invented in part with political cartoons that were published in Joseph Pulitzer's newspapers to sway public opinion in a certain way. And it's come to be known as the defining word for journalism that doesn't focus on facts. So it's news that is sensationalist, that tries to grab your attention with big, shiny pictures, or flashing ads or whatever it might be, and uses terms to try to get you excited and emotional rather than thinking logically about the information presented. And this newspaper war was directly influential in the United States going to war with Spain in Cuba and the Philippines. And so the way people try to share information, even if it's fake information, has real-world consequences. So it's important to remember that there is actual fake news. And that's different from people trying to say that something isn't real just because they don't trust that source or they don't agree with their opinion. But there are lots of people that spread patently false information. Sometimes they do it for fun. Sometimes they do it for other reasons. We'll get into that in a bit. But I think it's important to make a distinction here between fake news and satire. Satire's been around for a long time. I heard someone mention the words earlier, cancel culture. And there are some people that will say cancel culture doesn't exist. Well, anyone who knows what a mob is can understand how the internet could be used as a mob tool to try to force or pressure individuals or a company. And people have had their lives ruined because they stated an opinion or shared information that other people didn't like. That sounds like cancel culture to me. There are a number of comedians that have had a really hard time in the last little while in the United States of various political persuasions, but that have been restricted. They have been censored in their ability to try to make people laugh because they've offended groups of people or individuals. And whether you think that's right or wrong is a totally separate issue, but satire is not the same as fake news. And the big difference here is intent. Ask yourself, is this meant to give me false information, impressions, or assumptions? So is the purpose of the information being shared to get me to actually believe something that's false? Or is this meant to critique a real situation using hyperbole? Something that's so over the top and ridiculous that unless you have not a very good amount of social awareness, you would understand that it's ridiculous. So, fake news on the one hand, the intent is for you not to think, but just accept the information, right? They want you to, boom, grab your attention. They want you to absorb it and say, well, that's terrible, and not to think through any fallacies that it might contain or other things that there might be problems with. Satire, on the other hand, its intent is for you to think about an issue by drawing attention using absurdity, right? And so let's look at some examples. So, some older fake news. Okay. So, go away. Here we have King George II. There were people that spread fake news that he was ill to try to undermine the king's political support, right? He wasn't sick, but it spread quite a bit before the rumors were able to be quashed, and it did have an effect. 1803. So they're getting ready to have war in France, and this letter gets delivered to the Lord Mayor of London, and he jumps on it, and it says that there's secretly going to be a peace deal. And it causes the London Stock Exchange to jump 5%. In 1803, that's a lot, right? But then afterwards, after examining it, they determined the letter to be fake. But they were never able to determine who sent the letter based on who sold what and how they profited by the stock market going up. 1835, the New York Sun published, they noticed that their readership was flagging, so they published this series of articles about this fabulous life on the moon. And it was only after it was completely done that they said, no, we just made it up. So this lady lost a bunch of money gambling, but she didn't want to be embarrassed by that and have to tell her husband, so she invented the story that she was robbed on the train. And it created this national outrage. And people were really upset by this. And her story wasn't questioned because less than a week later, someone actually was robbed on the train. And so they thought, well, this story must be true. But eventually it came out that no, she had made it up because she had lost money gambling. People tried to profit off of the serial killer Jack the Ripper in London. There would be people that would print fake stories of the Ripper being arrested, or that they had found out who it was, or things like that, to try to sell papers on the street, even though the stories were fake. And so in the interest of time, we won't get through the others, but you can see people have been making stuff up for a long time. So here's some example of fake news as propaganda. Okay, so this is from The Independent. And so you see this headline, Muslim women run down during anti-Islamic rally in Brussels. So it's something that actually happened. But up in the URL bar, you can see what the original headline was, that they jumped on and said, Muslim woman run down by far-right activist at an anti-Islamic rally. So this woman was killed. She was run over in Brussels. And they flew this big thing. They jumped right on it and said that it was this far-right militant activist who drove a car through and killed her on purpose. Well, no, it was an accident by two young Muslim young men who weren't paying attention. And so real-world consequences because people didn't check their sources. And it was in service of a particular political narrative. Fake news that damages people's reputations. Does anyone remember when this article from the Rolling Stone came out? How shocking it was? And then it never happened. But all the members of that lacrosse team, everything that happened to them, everything they went through, all of the hateful things that were said to them and the things that they were accused of. And think about the damage this does to actual victims of rape. Right? You know, things like this happen and people say, well, oh, they made it up. Right? This makes it harder for, you know, law enforcement professionals to do their job. And you know, it destroyed these boys' reputation. Fake news that fooled reporters. It happens. So Dan Rather, very well-known news reporter, was given this memo, supposedly written in 1973, talking about George W. Bush's service in the Air National Guard. And so they had this breaking news story about it. Well, it turned out that the document was a forgery. And so it was very embarrassing for Dan Rather. He got so excited about the possibility of a scoop that he didn't look into it more fully. Fake news that is still repeated. Okay. So, this is a very touchy subject in the United States in terms of racial disparity and violence. But in order for there to be real change, it has to be based on truth. And when the riots in Ferguson, Missouri happened after Michael Brown was shot, this, hands up, don't shoot, was something that was spread very quickly, rapidly across all sorts of national news outlets, that he had said that and he was not doing anything, when the Justice Department under President Obama, after a very lengthy investigation, determined that that was not true, that the officer had reason to do what he did. Whether he was justified in killing him, I'm not going to get into that, but the political incendiary phrase was not true. And it had real consequences, and I saw a woman a couple months ago in Mankato that had this on a shirt. And it brings up a very important point and something that needs to be talked about and things that need to change. But if it's based on a lie, you're undermining your entire position in terms of your ability to talk to people that have a differing opinion. Okay, so lots of examples of fake news. Now let's take a couple looks at satire. So this is The Onion. Okay. Newly uncovered manuscript reveals China invented English language 700 years before Western world. Beijing. Shedding new light on the origins of the world's most popular language, an international team of linguists announced Thursday that a newly uncovered manuscript confirms China invented both spoken and written English 700 years before the Western world. These remarkably well-preserved bamboo slips appear to show that Zhou dynasty scholars developed the English tongue as far back as the 3rd century BC, long before the language arose in Britain, said Li Zhang, a professor of comparative linguistics who examined the text, which outlines the alphabet and basic grammar rules of English, in addition to including the first known uses of words such as barbecue and philanthropy. By the time Anglo-Saxons began cobbling together their language from Latin, French, and Germanic sources, the Chinese had already mastered it. There are even some passages in this manuscript that appear eerily similar to the work of Shakespeare, though they are of far superior quality. Li went on to explain that the Chinese gradually abandoned the English language, finding its 26-letter alphabet too limiting and opting instead for the convenience of Mandarin's more than 50,000 characters. So remember, satire is designed to stop and make you think. So this is very silly, right? Because your background knowledge lets you know that this cannot be true, right? But what is it trying to get us to think about? What is the message here? Okay, so if any of you ever watch, listen, or read Chinese state media, it will sound exactly like this in terms of we are the most amazing, wonderful people in the world, and we did it first, and we did it better, right? Satire for society. So this is the Babylon Bee. Catholic plans to spend Lent giving up something he really shouldn't have been doing in the first place. Queens, New York. Semi-practicing Catholic Jack Nunnik announced today that he intends to honor Lent by giving up something that he really shouldn't have been doing anyway. The 40 days of Lent are a time when many Catholic and Orthodox Christians and a few Protestant weirdos fast from something as a way of reflecting and preparing their hearts for Good Friday and Easter Sunday and honoring Christ's 40-day fast in the desert. For many, it's a time to take a break from things that aren't sinful in and of themselves, going to distract them from serving God. For others, it's just kind of what everyone else is doing, so might as well. This time of year is really difficult because there are so many things I probably should get up, but I'm not really sure I want to. Like, honoring Christ's sacrifice is important to me or whatever, but I also don't want to do anything that will, change my life too much. So, Nunnik said he's considering giving up things like sleeping with his girlfriend, getting blackout drunk, texting his ex, using God's name as a curse word, texting his ex-sister, visiting filthy websites or littering. I think at this point, I'm tending toward cutting back on carbs. So again, patently ridiculous, right? But again, trying to get you to think about a topic. Think about people that are lukewarm in their beliefs, or people that, some people might say are hypocritical, or different things. And so satire can cover a wide range of things, but we should be able to tell the difference between satire and fake news. Okay, so who are fact checkers? So fake news exists. Well, how do we determine if news is fake? Well, helpfully or not, in the last few years on the internet, we've had the growth of fact checkers. And so what is a fact checker? It's a person or organization that critiques news and social media. Are they self-declared arbiters of truth or champions of truth? Are they judge and jury or journalist and expert witness? Gatekeepers and censors or something else? Who do they work for? What authority or credentials do they have to do what they do? What reason do you have to believe them? So we're going to take a look at the four most common fact-checking websites. First up is Politifact. How many of you have seen or heard of Politifact? Okay, all right. So Politifact is owned by the Poynter Institute, and it's funded by news media companies. So they have a vested interest in preserving certain narratives. Factcheck.org. How many of you have heard of factcheck.org? Okay. They're owned by the University of Pennsylvania and funded by a news media family and by Facebook. The Washington Post fact checker. They're owned by the Washington Post, of course, which is now owned by Jeff Bezos. And Snopes.com. How many of you have heard of Snopes?
Yeah.
Okay, a few more hands there, right? So it was started by a husband and wife in California to document internet and urban legends. So fake news wasn't really their thing. It was just the weird things that people put on the internet, right? All those email chain letters you used to get. Right now, they're hard up for money due to legal fees, amounting to almost 20 to 40% of their yearly costs related to an internal power struggle between shareholders. Now, do you notice what I did here? Is their financial funding relevant to their validity?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. It could be, but not necessarily. So that's a fallacy right there, right? But how many of them are transparent about these things? So one thing that fact checkers pride themselves on is wanting to be transparent about their process. And unfortunately, that's something that they haven't lived up to that standard in some ways. Fact-checking provides a third-party source of accountability to help combat fast-spreading rumors and false information. They are doing important work, but they don't always get it right, and sometimes there's bias. So who fact-checks the fact-checkers? Right? So, information comes out. Your friend shared it on social media. Your friend shared it, so it must be credible. Fact checker pops up and says, no, this is false. But then 3 weeks later, a news article comes out and says, oh wait, it was true. So how in the world are you supposed to know? Why are fact checkers a good idea? What do you think?
I think it forces you to look at it a little bit.
Okay, so it gives you that opportunity to pause and think about your initial reaction. Remember, fake news and propaganda, they want you to take that initial hit and just run with it. Emotionally, with opinion, with your assumptions and perspective, your personal bias, whatever it might be. And so when there is a fact check, it gives you that chance to think about it. Why are fact checkers a bad idea?
They could be just as biased as what you're reading.
They can. Absolutely. Are fact checkers creating another gatekeeper to information? Yes. Right? Which would you trust more? A fact checker that claims to be completely nonpartisan and objective in their fact checking? Or a fact checker that admits personal opinions and bias but works to exclude them from their fact checking? Which would you trust more?
The second.
Why?
Well, because they're saying, this is what I believe, but now I've looked at it differently, and I try to look at it, you know, in a different venue, a different tone. You know, just because I believe it doesn't mean it's always true.
It has a sound of more openness, transparency.
Yes.
And it's kind of like what we think we are individually. We have opinions, but we try to sometimes separate them. So it
Exactly.
sounds like us.
Yes, yep. It sounds more relatable. It sounds more real. The thing about, okay, if you believe that a fact checker is completely nonpartisan and objective, then you are more likely to assume that their words will not have bias. Right?
They always do.
But if you know where the person is coming from, then it helps you to understand why they wrote the way they wrote. So is there any accountability with fact checkers? Well, let's find out. So there's the International Fact-Checking Network. We'll go ahead and take a look at that very briefly. Oh, wait a minute, they're owned by the Poynter Institute, which owns Politifact, so they certify themselves. That's not questionable at all. So yeah, they are part of the Poynter Institute, and the International Fact-Checking Network is, again, partly funded by Facebook. And we've already looked at how Facebook has acted as a gatekeeper and a censor. They do have some really good, strong principles to follow, and you can go through and read what it is that they expect fact checkers to have as qualities. But they have a history of not evenly or consistently applying those principles and standards. So they're certainly trying, but they're not there yet. So here are some of the most common complaints that you see about fact checkers. Number one is they're not disclosing political bias and involvement. So you get a fact checker who chooses to fact check a piece of information, and they're supposed to be transparent about any sort of connections they have to the topic, and sometimes they don't. Number two, shallow research resulting in improper judgments. They fact check something based on a 5-minute Google search. Now sometimes that can turn up all the relevant information you need, and sometimes, no, it doesn't. A lack of transparency in their process and criteria. So it's commonly asked, okay, what do you choose to select to fact check? And why do you make those selections? And what are the questions that you ask? And these companies have not been forthright in saying what those processes are. And again, a lack of agreed standards and definitions. Refusal to review or correct fact checks that are biased, misleading, or incorrect. And so this happens in different forums in which some of the better fact-checking websites, these ones are more prominent, they have a way for you to submit a question or a clarification about a fact check that was done. Facebook has a process for that as well, but even when evidence is presented that a fact check was biased or was censorship of some kind, they don't always change it because it's in someone's best interest, but not necessarily everyone's informationally. And then they issue corrections, but not as visibly available as the original fact check. And that's a frustrating one because the internet does make this hard. So it's not always on them. Once it's out there on the internet, it can spread so fast.
Right.
And then even if it was only partly true or if it was false, letting everybody know who saw the original content know that, okay, that was wrong, is very difficult to do. And so that's a tough one. It's a tough one. So what do? People are trying to fact check. They're not perfect, just like we're not perfect. What can you do? Well, you can be your own fact checker. Remember propaganda and partisanship? Check multiple sources. Don't believe it just because someone else says you should trust them. And we're going to get into this more next week, the problems of the 24/7 news cycle and how that impacts this process of fact checking. So, fact checking 101, here's what you do. Never trust a headline. Everyone heard of clickbait, right? The headline has absolutely nothing to do with the content of the article, or the headline is extremely misleading, where the main point of the article that can actually contradict the headline is way far down in the article, right? Headlines that omit things that are very important to the piece of information. Always look for a primary source. If there's a quotation, find the whole context. We're about out of time, so I don't have time to click this link, but it's a story from a local journalist in Fort Worth, Texas. He was doing a story on a court case, and he had spoken to a lawyer, and the lawyer came back and said, "What is this article that you wrote? You completely taken my quotes out of context. What is this?" And so this journalist looked up the article, and someone had created a fake version of the newspaper as a website that looked similar. They had even put his name and his photograph attached to the article, and completely changed the tone of the article. And so just because something's in quotation marks and it says it's attributed to a person, don't believe it. Never trust a photo online. And this one's important. Photos can be digitally edited. They can be deceptively staged, or they can be reused photographs. This happens all the time with things shared on social media. Someone will share a post and say that it's from last week when that photograph was taken 8 years ago. Digitally edited photographs, there was a photographer for Reuters that was fired because he digitally edited a photograph of some conflict in the Middle East to make it look worse than it actually was. Deceptively staged angle and perspective are important into what you think you see. Photographers practice this and they understand this, but when we look at the picture, we just think, oh, that's the point of view. But if you look at things from a different angle, things can look very different. And so that's something to remember. Video and audio is suspect too. The reason for that are thanks to advances in technology, deep fakes, and artificial intelligence. It is now possible using computer rendering to create a video and audio that looks like a person says something and they never actually said that. And it looks, to the human eye, it looks real. And it sounds real because the artificial intelligence has listened to, hundreds of minutes of this person speaking. So public figures are a big target for this. And then it can use that tone and inflection and mathematically combine it together to make it look like the person said something.
Intentional, but I think even video like stores, they show you a store,
Mm-hmm.
and it looks like it's forever. And
Right.
it might really only be a half a block,
Perspective. How many of you have seen a news article about a news anchor trying to make a storm report look like it's worse than it is? Right? And so they're like going like this, like the wind's terrible, and then some people walk by. Sensationalism and drama, but you won't know if you're not there because, again, they're gatekeepers.
And they show it over and over and over again, and you think, oh my goodness, it must be terrible.
Yep.
Which it maybe was.
So don't accept information because of who shared it with you or who said it. Accept it if you can prove it is true. And consider its implications. Maybe not consider it itself, but consider its implications if it makes a valid point, but you can't disprove it. Doesn't mean you have to believe it, but you could at least think about what are the implications. Think about what information or perspectives are missing from the story. That's what gatekeeping is deciding what information is available. And so think about what's missing. How does it change the article's tone or conclusion about what happened? Try to find a second independent source if you can. Probably that offers a different perspective, preferably. And then find a third, fourth, etc. if you can. So we don't have time for practice because there were lots of questions tonight, which is great. But just to review, trying to control information flow has been around a long time, but technology has made it both easier and harder in different aspects. Don't accept someone else's dismissive label of information. Do they provide evidence that you can independently examine and verify? Is their reasoning logically valid? Okay, the parable of the blind man and the elephant. So this is an old Buddhist story. Is anyone familiar with this? I see some head nodding. Okay, good. Is anyone not familiar with it? A couple people. Okay, so some blind men are walking through the jungle and they come upon an elephant, and each of them feels a different part of the elephant. One feels the trunk and says it's a snake. One feels the tusk and says it's a spear. One feels the ear and says it's a fan. One feels the tail and says it's a brush. One feels a leg and says it's a trunk. They each have a part of the whole, but they're missing the big picture. And this happens is if you're only given one perspective, you're not seeing everything else. And so censorship and gatekeeping. Everyone has limited perspective and focus along with assumptions and bias. It affects all of us. We're all the blind men in some respect. And so I was going to take a look at some things here. So these are examples of differing perspectives. You can look at news from other sources, and we'll come back to these since we don't have time tonight. But USA Today, which is owned by the same company that owns one of the fact-checking groups, BBC News, Al Jazeera, the Times of India, and the People's Daily. What kind of things do they think are important? What are they posting? How do they phrase things? What does it look like? And so we'll take a look at those next time. But we are out of time, and thank you everyone for all the comments and questions this time. And so we'll end it here for tonight and stay warm. So.